Welcome to Shadows of History. Join us as we delve into real, dark crimes and baffling mysteries that time couldn't bury. Prepare for chilling tales and unsolved enigmas. Today's episode is a special one. Inspired by The Handmaid's Tale, we uncover the real-world histories that echo its darkest themes. Stories of women silenced, controlled, and forgotten. Let's peel back the fiction and see what history reveals.
Welcome to Shadows of History. You know, some stories they really get under your skin, don't they? They paint this picture of a future that feels, well, uncomfortably plausible, like Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale.
Absolutely. That book, it's powerful.
It is, and it depicts Gilead, this incredibly oppressive society where women's bodies are just completely controlled, their identities almost erased, reduced to a function.
Yeah.
And the most terrifying part is that feeling, that little voice asking, could this actually happen?
Well, that feeling you're talking about, that deep unease, that's precisely why The Handmaid's Tale sticks with us.
Right.
But as we've been digging into this, what's maybe even more disturbing is realizing how much of that awful future, it isn't really future at all.
So.
It's not pure invention. So many of the darkest things in Gilead are, well, echoes. Echoes of the past.
Okay, let's really lean into that. We've been looking at some material that makes exactly that argument, that Atwood's world, in some of its most horrifying details, actually has these deep roots in real history.
Exactly. And so our mission in this deep dive is really to pull apart those historical threads.
Right.
To unpack these parallels and, try to understand how the control of women's bodies, the commodification, the brutality, how it's shown up across different times and places.
And what that tells us about power, maybe? And what it means for us now?
Precisely. Because recognizing these histories, it's important for understanding today.
So the main idea here is that Gilead systems forced reproduction, erasing autonomy, state violence. They weren't just dreamt up, they reflect things that actually happened.
That's the core of it, yeah.
Yeah.
So where do we start? Maybe with the most central, horrifying role in Gilead, the handmaid.
Okay.
Which is all about forced reproduction, right? The commodification of fertile bodies. Where does the source material say we can find a precedent for that?
It points pretty directly and powerfully to the reality for enslaved African-American women in the American South.
Absolutely. Under chattel slavery, enslaved women.
Yeah.
They weren't just seen as laborers. They were fundamentally property. Yeah. And their ability to reproduce, that was a key economic driver for the people who enslaved them. Bearing children wasn't about family or choice.
No.
It was about creating new assets, new human beings born into bondage, adding to the owner's wealth.
It wasn't just about, increasing the workforce, though, was it? The source talks about the sheer brutality.
Oh, absolutely. Systematic rape by owners was, well, it was a horrific constant, a tool of terror, but also a mechanism to increase the enslaved population purely for profit.
So pregnancies, children, they were just economic calculations.
Completely. Calculated opportunities. It's a stark contrast to Gilead's focus on rare fertility, isn't it?
Yeah.
In the 19th century South, fertility wasn't rare, but it was just as manipulated, just as controlled, just as commodified for the benefit of the powerful. The value wasn't scarcity, it was exploitable abundance.
And the source really brings that home with a specific account, doesn't it?
It does. It mentions Harriet Jacobs. She wrote Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, one of the very few accounts we have from an enslaved woman's perspective.
And what does she say?
She wrote about how motherhood, for her, didn't bring joy. It brought dread.
Yeah.
Because her children were born into the exact same chains she wore. Her body, her ability to have children, it belonged entirely to her enslaver.
God, that's...
Yeah. The source puts it powerfully. Black women's wombs were literally politicized, weaponized against them.
The parallel the source draws is just searingly clear, isn't it? No choice, no consent, no freedom.
That's the line. That's the thread connecting these histories straight to Gilead. The mechanism of control serves the same end, denying women agency over their own bodies for the benefit of a system hungry for power.
Okay. So that's one profound historical echo. But the source also points to another really disturbing area, medicine.
Yes. It brings up J. Marion Sims, often called the father of modern gynecology.
Right. I've heard the name, but there's a dark side.
A very dark side. The source details how Sims built his reputation, developed his surgical techniques by experimenting repeatedly on enslaved women.
Experiment.
And crucially, he did this without anesthesia.
What? Without any pain relief? How is that even justified?
Well, the pervasive, incredibly cruel belief back then was that Black people, especially enslaved women, just didn't feel pain the same way white people did, or that they could somehow tolerate immense suffering.
That's appalling.
It is. So Sims performed surgery after surgery. He focused on fistula repair on the same women, sometimes dozens of times. The source mentions one woman, Anarcha. She reportedly endured over 30 operations without anesthesia.
30. That's unimaginable suffering. They weren't patients getting care.
Absolutely not. The source is really clear on this. They were test subjects, forced to endure agony, violation, all in the name of medical progress. Their bodies were just laboratories for his ambition.
And the Gilead parallel there is?
It's disturbing. Think about how in Gilead, these clinical, often brutal procedures around reproduction are wrapped up in religious ritual.
Right, presented as necessary or holy somehow.
Exactly. And historically, these horrific experiments were cloaked in the language of science, of progress.
Yeah.
Both stripped the women of agency, of dignity. They reduced them to biological subjects, walking wombs in Gilead's case.
So control and brutality, just masked by appeals to science or divine order. Where else did this kind of systemic control happen? The source gives other examples.
Oh, yes. Look at Britain. The Magdalen laundries and the workhouses.
Magdalen laundries, I've heard of those. Who ended up there?
It was women who were seen as troublesome or fallen, women who didn't fit into society's narrow boxes, especially unwed mothers or women seen as promiscuous. They weren't prisons exactly, but they were definitely carceral institutions.
And what was it like inside?
The source describes forced, backbreaking labor, terrible living conditions. Childbirth was apparently brutal, and often mothers were immediately separated from their babies, just taken away.
Why? What was the stated purpose?
Officially, to correct them,
Yeah.
make them penitent for their, supposed sins or social mistakes.
That idea, being corrected through suffering, that sounds very Gilead, doesn't it? Pain being holy, obedience being purity.
It resonates strongly, yeah. And the key thing the source stresses, this wasn't fiction. This wasn't some fringe idea. This was policy. Institutional, societal policy designed to punish women specifically for stepping outside the lines drawn around female behavior, sexuality, motherhood.
Controlling their bodies and lives to enforce a certain social order.
Precisely.
And the source finds another example. In France.
Yes, focusing on state control over vulnerable girls. From about the 17th to the 19th centuries, you had thousands of orphaned or abandoned girls raised in state-run hospices. The Fils de la Charité, Daughters of Charity.
Okay, Daughters of Charity. How did that system shape their lives?
Well, the source explains they weren't really raised for education or independence. The focus was utility, training them for domestic service mostly, or arranging early marriages. And tragically, the source notes those sent into service were incredibly vulnerable to sexual abuse in the homes they worked in.
Oh, no. And if they got pregnant from that?
They were almost always blamed, punished. The very system meant to care for them would then institutionalize them again if they became pregnant. It was this awful cycle.
So the child would just get sucked back into the system.
Often, yes. Absorbed back into the same state system that trapped the mother.
It sounds like the state just took over everything. Family, control.
It really did. The source uses this phrase. The state became their mother, father, and warden, made all the decisions. These girls had, quote, no say, none, about their lives, their bodies, their futures.
Wow.
The source calls them a ghost in the archives. Their individual voices are just so hard to recover, buried under all the official records.
So we've got these 4 examples. The American South, medical exploitation, British laundries, French hospices. Different places, different times, but there's a pattern. What does the source say connects them?
It makes a really crucial point. These aren't just weird, isolated incidents. They are widespread, recurring patterns. You see them across different cultures, different centuries.
And the common thread is?
The overwhelming commonality is the systematic control of women's bodies, their reproduction, their choices, their futures. And this control wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate tool, often state-sanctioned, used for religious power, political power, economic power.
So Atwood didn't really invent the blueprint for Gilead. She synthesized it from history.
That's exactly the argument. She didn't need to conjure these horrors purely from imagination. She collected these fragments of real history.
Like what?
Like the rituals used to justify control, The indoctrination of women into specific roles, the constant surveillance, the medical exploitation framed as necessary, the silencing of women who didn't conform, these things existed, often side by side throughout history.
And that control, it went beyond just reproduction itself, right? Gilead has its strict castes. Handmaids, Martha's wives. The source connects that too.
Absolutely. The source points out how societies have historically been obsessed with categorizing women, forcing them into these rigid roles based mostly on their marital status and their perceived reproductive function.
Like in Victorian England.
That's a prime example the source uses. Women were rigidly boxed in. The virtuous wife, the fallen woman, the angel in the house, the factory girl. And each box came with incredibly strict rules. Step outside. Severe consequences.
And where you fit often depended on your reproductive status.
Fundamentally, a wealthy wife struggling with infertility may be pitied, may be sidelined, her worth diminished because she couldn't reproduce.
Right.
But a fertile servant girl, she might be seen as, well, fair game for exploitation because of her fertility. Her body commodified, abused, with almost no social protection. Crossing those lines, getting pregnant, unmarried, seeking independence, it led to punishment, ostracism, or being locked away like in the laundries or hospices we talked about.
The source calls these things quiet tyrannies. That's a really striking phrase. Why quiet?
Powerful, isn't it? Quiet because the women who suffered most were systematically silenced. Their voices were suppressed, their experiences ignored, deliberately left out of official histories. Or, if written about, it was by others, by the men in charge, the doctors, the judges. They didn't get to tell their own stories.
So, if the official records erase them, where do we find their stories now?
The source suggests looking in the margins, in the footnotes almost.
Like
Terse notes buried in old hospital records. Cold official language in court documents, sometimes. Memoirs like Harriet Jacobs's. Desperate, anonymous letters may be smuggled out of institutions. You have to actively hunt for these fragments, you know? Piece together a story from sources that never intended to capture her perspective. It's like historical detective work, uncovering these ghosts.
Okay, so the power of The Handmaid's Tale is its plausibility, right? That feeling it could happen.
Yes, that potential future shock is its literary power. But the power of history, and the source makes this really clear, is its testimony.
Testimony.
The stark, undeniable fact that women actually lived in their own kinds of Gilead. Their bodies, quite literally, were not their own.
And unlike June's story in the book, which is fiction, a story of resistance survival telling her tale.
Exactly. The systems that controlled these real historical women weren't hypothetical dystopias. They were real. State-sanctioned. Institutional. Sometimes even celebrated as necessary for morality or progress.
Right.
So, while we watch June fight back in the story, we have to remember the countless real women throughout history who had no chance to resist like that, who lived and suffered in total anonymity. No spotlight, no escape road. For so many, there was just silence.
And maybe that difference between the fictional resistance we root for and the historical silence, maybe that's the most important takeaway here.
I think it might be. Looking back at these histories, it's not just about seeing how far we've supposedly come. It's about recognizing how fragile that distance really is. History doesn't repeat exactly, sure, but the patterns of control, especially over women's bodies, they're disturbingly persistent.
The warning from this material feels incredibly relevant, urgent almost.
It really is.
Yeah.
If these systems of control happened before, and if we let ourselves forget how they worked, the ideas behind them, the human cost, the source warns us very clearly, it can happen again.
So, as we look around the world right now, at all the debates, the laws, the questions swirling around women's bodies, reproduction, autonomy, the question becomes, what are we doing? Actively, consciously doing to make sure that history stays history. Because what this deep dive shows is that stories like The Handmaid's Tale, they aren't just warnings about some potential future, they're stark reminders of what already was.
And maybe a chilling question about what might still be if we stop paying attention.
We really hope this deep dive has given you, well, maybe an unsettling perspective, but an important one, seeing how even fictional dystopias can be so deeply rooted in the painful realities of the past.
Thanks for joining us on Shadows of History.
Please like and subscribe if you found this valuable, and join us next time as we continue to explore the echoes of the past.
There's always more hidden between the lines of history. Until next time, stay curious.